Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 3 of Casual Watch Talk. This is my podcast that is linked to my Casual Watch Review YouTube channel. If this is your first time listening, welcome. I've done 2 previous podcasts, one where we looked at the Omega Apollo 11, and then a second one where we talked about where's the best place to buy watches on the internet with a good friend of mine, Steve. We talked about forums, etc. Now, in this week's episode, I'm joined by a good friend to the channel, Todd, who's a long-time watch collector, but he has an affinity for vintage Seikos, and in particular, vintage Seiko chronographs. Now, if you're thinking that you know nothing about Seiko chronographs, I'm in that boat as well. I know next to nothing about them, so hopefully this will be extremely interesting for both of us to listen to. So, Todd, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Sam, for having me. It's very exciting.
A question I always love to start with is, tell us a bit about how you kind of got into watches.
Yeah, it's like you, I'm an engineer, and I used to take apart my dad's old Timexes back when the Timex made the little automatics, and they'd stop working, and I'd take them apart. And of course, that's about all I'd achieve. But it always fascinated me, just the intricacy and how they worked, and then. Growing up, I was a motorhead, and when I got into my teens, and my buddies and I used to buy old cars. We'd fix them up, we'd race them. We do track days. I grew up around Atlanta, so we used to do track days at Road Atlanta, and we used to work on 914s, which are one of my favorite automobiles of all time. And used to be able to buy them fairly inexpensively, and that's not so true anymore. Like so many, like Seiko chronographs. But it just fascinated me too, the linkage between chronographs, racing chronographs, and motorsports. And it's like your picture on your Casual Watch Reviewer YouTube channel. You have a picture of Steve McQueen with his tag Hoyer Monaco. And I remember I would bump into famous race car drivers. I bumped into Paul Newman back when he was racing for Newman Haas in his own racing outfit.
Wow.
And he was just a regular guy at the track, and there were many others like that. It kind of had this association with some of these elites, movie star racers, or just Mario Andretti, these sorts of guys. You occasionally see them, and they'd always have these great watches, and so I got ever more intrigued with it. And in fact, when I was racing, I was going to college, and I did something I shouldn't have done, and I bought my first new watch, which was a Seiko chronograph. It was the first second year of their quartz chronographs that they released they started them in 1983. I have the 1984 one, and I still own it. And it's just fascinating, just how these work, and the peel is, I guess, stirs up all that cool testosterone the same way racing cars do. So anyhow, that's kind of how I got into it. And as I've gotten older, I've been able to kind of pay attention to it a little bit more, and I've been concentrating more on Seiko, vintage Seiko chronographs. I have other chronographs too, Hamilton and Omega and such, but the Seiko chronographs are really special to me.
I know Seiko had so many firsts that they did in the watch industry. I was wondering whether the chronograph was a technology that they advanced.
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to go back to, they had some of the first chronograph they ever did was a mono pusher for the Tokyo Olympics, and I believe it was 1964, but I'm not exactly certain of the date. But those are, very, very difficult to get a hold of. And then they further developed, these chronographs, and these were manual line chronographs. But the chronograph they're probably best known for, at least with vintage Seiko folks, is what is often called the Pogue, which is a nickname for the 6139 series of chronographs, which debuted for the most part in 1969. Although we do know now, because of investigations and people paying attention, that Seiko meaning, might have developed the first automatic chronograph period. They might have actually produced, we know they were the first to mass market the automatic chronograph, because we have dates of it came out in early 1969. But there's some other picture evidence now, and some other records that perhaps they actually started these in Japan in 1968. So they would have beaten both El Primero, the Zenith group, as well as the Caliber 11 consortium of various watch manufacturers, Hamilton, Buren. Uh, it was I'm just drawing a blank on some of the other ones, the big guys, that were working on the chronographs at
Yeah.
the time. Hewer and others, and they may have come out with the world's first world's first automatic chronograph. And when they did, they did it with a vertical clutch. They did it with a column wheel movement. It's very sophisticated, high technology at the time. So it's very impressive. And then my watch, which is 1984 quartz chronograph, Seiko also invented the world's first analog quartz chronograph. And this is I believe it's around 15 joules. It's all metal. It's the 7A, mine's a 7A38, which is the movement designator. And these are really amazing. These are watches that were made to last a lifetime. And mine even survived a house fire. And Spencer Klein, one of the renowned Seiko restorers, restored it for me. And I'm holding it right now, and it works beautifully. Lots of stuff like that Seiko was doing first.
So when you talk about a mono pushing chronograph, just to clarify here, is this how we would think of a modern sort of mechanical chronograph where it had subdials, or is it a different configuration where the second hand of the watch, does it look like an ordinary analog watch?
Well, the mono pusher one they did was, so we normally associate chronographs with, they have two pushers, right? You have the start and stop, basically. But what Seiko did back in 1964, it was the caliber 5719. And you're right, there were no subdials. It just had what would normally associate the second hand, the large second hand, was your chronograph second hand. And you had to keep track of how many times that went around. Every 60 seconds, you'd have to keep track of the minute. And they had an outside dial, like a dive watch. I believe it was articulating, so you could actually move and keep track of it. In 1970, the Danish Seiko group, which is Seiko was divided into two different groups, Sua and Danny group. And the Danny group came up with their 7017 chronograph, which also didn't have subdials. It had two actuator buttons on the right, the same as what we think old chronographs usually have. But it was actually the world record thinnest chronograph movement. And it was an automatic. They set that world record at the time. So again, this is another first for Seiko. It's fascinating. And those chronographs are just incredible. I have one. It's currently being there was a problem with one of the gears in it after it was restored down at Vintage Time, Australia. And the gentleman there, Adrian Selleck, has it, and he had to go and find and dig up some new old stock parts to replace a chronograph wheel in it for me. But that'll be coming back to me soon. But these are big, they're beautiful chronographs. They're true flyback chronographs. So while it's running, you could push the lower right button and it would fly back to zero, and then you'd let go and it would resume timing again. So Seiko has a really interesting combination of first and technologies that all came around, let's say, the 64 to 70 timeframe.
They don't make a mechanical chronograph anymore, is my understanding. Is it just that quartz became so cheap?
I think that's exactly like so many other manufacturers. It's odd that that Seiko pioneered the quartz movement. They weren't the first to come up with it necessarily. It was actually, I believe, originally developed way back in the 30s, but no one knew how to do anything with it. But with the 6139 series of movements, like what is known as the Pogue, so if we go from let's say 68-ish, 69, the production ended around 1978, I believe. So almost 10 years. And after that, because of the quartz revolution, Seiko, to my knowledge, didn't make any chronographs until they came up again with the one I mentioned, which is the 7A series of chronographs back in 1983. So between those two dates, what is that, about, let's say, 5 years or so, they did not didn't make any.
That's amazing. So the vintage mechanical chronographs that you collecting were really within like a 10-year band of
Yes,
manufacturers. Uh,
exactly. And the Seiko folks that really chase the different versions of the chronograph are really only chasing, let's say the 6139s, chase those through those 10 years, and there's different versions through those 10 years in different sub markets, like the Japanese domestic market or the JDM versions. And they have maybe different text on the dial, and so they're chasing after, or different dial colors too. So it's those variations that are very popular with the Seiko chronograph collectors.
10 years is like a blink of the eye for the watch industry, isn't it, really? When I think of Seiko chronographs, the first thing I think is about the Pogue, obviously. Is that the most famous, you would say, of the vintage models of Seiko? Was there others that were pioneers? And if anybody's not familiar with the Pogue, I'm sure Todd will get into the story, but it was one of the first Seikos into space.
Oh, right. It was the world's first automatic chronograph in space. It was Colonel William Pogue, it's kind of named after, brought a gold dial, his personal gold dial Seiko watch. He bought it a PX, and it's the one that's around 1971 or so. It performed flawlessly. NASA never thought an automatic would necessarily work well in space. Now, he didn't do it on any EVAs, but he never used it outside of the space station, the Skylab. He had it on his wrist. He had it on one wrist, and he had his Omega Speedmaster on the other wrist. And there's lots of pictures of him in Skylab with that, because he got used to using his Seiko speed timer, the gold dialed one, during training sessions in the simulators. He used it to time engine burns. And so he got used to using it, because the Seiko speed timer also has an internal bezel that's articulated through the crown, so you can spin it back and forth, and this was very handy for him. And it worked out beautifully. So when it was discovered sometime later that watch actually was the first automatic chronograph in space, it became very famous as a result, and it was actually auctioned off to help a charity that Colonel Pogues supported. I forgot exactly when the date was. I believe it was in the 90s, and it went for about $6,000 or so. I can't imagine what that watch is worth today if it were to show up. Its whereabouts are unknown. The actual Pogue, we don't know where it is. But that would be fascinating. But the Pogue, like you said, the 6139, is by far, I think, the most famous and probably the most collectible of the Seiko chronographs.
I mean, I've always loved the look of the vintage Seiko chronographs, but one of the things that I know about them is that they can be quite tricky. You really seem to have to know what you're doing to find a decent example. And also, I know restoring them can be tricky. Is that a reality?
Oh, it is a reality. I'll give you two recent examples. And it's true. What's nice, though, is that there's so much enthusiasm for these chronographs that there's a number of restorers that specialize in these. So you wouldn't want to take your Seiko 6139, your 6138, your 7017 to just your down the street watch, watch repairers or such, unless they have experience in it, because they're different. And in order to do it right, you need somebody who's very experienced, because of the intricacies in these chronographs. Their tight tolerances, the spring tensions in some of the movements are very, very important to set them properly. And there's lots of nuances. The same way you wouldn't want to go for heart surgery by your family doctor. You want to go to a specialist that's done 1,000 different types of heart surgeries. And so the trick is first to find a reputable Seiko restorer who does the chronographs, and I use 3 different ones to help me out. And you can go to the forums, like the Seiko Citizen Watch Forum, for example. There's a number of folks there with excellent reputations. Currently, I'm using a gentleman named Simon Wilkinson, who's just he has a regular 9-to-5 job, but he does this on the weekends. And he's got one of mine now. And to your point, I bought a 1970 blue dial Pogue, or a 6139, but it has a proof marking on the dial. Now, the proof ones were the very first ones back when watches used to be able to say they were waterproof before the truth in advertising laws came into effect in the United States. So we didn't have many proof dials. They were only around for about a year. And I bought one off of an estate sale online, and it needed a lot of help. And when Simon got a hold of it, he found rusted parts. He found pieces that needed to be replaced, more than the usual things. Usually you replace crystals and gaskets and do that sort of thing, and then you rebuild the movements. But this needed a new jewel. It was missing the balance wheel jewel, the Diashock jewel, strange stuff like that. And so but he could source all these. And right now he still has it because the chronograph second hand, the big second hand, is slightly bent. He wants to try to straighten it, but there's a chance it could break. So he was able to locate new old stock 2-piece, which is the early version of these second hands that would go on a proof model. And so if he breaks it this weekend, we're going to put the new old stock that he found on it. See what I'm saying? It's very intricate. Now, to get to your other point, I also recently purchased a 6138. Now, the 6138s are actually later. They came out later, even though the number is one less than the 6139, because the movements were so complex that Seiko didn't want to release them yet. And so they came in after the 6139s. And these are the Panda dials. So these are the ones that have 2 subdials that Seiko makes. Made back in the late 60s. These actually came out in 1970 roughly in Japan, and so they have a second subdial which allows you to keep track of not just the minutes, but you keep track of hours, so you can go up to 12 hours on these. And one of the most popular ones are the bullheads, and you and I have talked about bullheads before.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I found through a guy I know in Cyprus. He bought one off the original owner who bought it in 1973 in Qatar, or Qatar, depending on how you pronounce the country. And he had it serviced 3 times over his lifetime. He's 80 some odd years old now, and he decided he was selling off some of his things. My friend bought it and sold it to me. It looked original, but when I sent it, it was running a little erratically, and I wanted to have it checked out to see if it needed to be serviced. I sent it to Simon, and he had to pull the dial off, and it was an aftermarket dial. Sometime during when this gentleman had his watch serviced, the servicing company switched the dials.
Wow.
And so I thought I was buying an all original, and an all original blue bullhead is kind of an expensive watch. They can go $1,000 or more if they're in really good shape. And now it's not. So I'm like, oh no. So I had to call him up or FaceTimed him or whatever. And I said, look what's happened. And he was really devastated. And so he took it back and refunded my money. And, he doesn't know what he's going to do with it now exactly. So the point is that it's really hard, and you need help a lot of times to make sure you get something that's original. Because if that's what you think you're paying for, if you can buy ones without original dials, and if you're happy with that, that's fine. But just keep in mind that the watch is worth half what it would be if it were original. And if that's all you're paying for, then that's okay. But a lot of times these watches are coming out of certain countries that are notorious for producing these Frankens, where they kind of sneak them in, and they say they're original and they're not. And so the key is just to learn all you can about them and be able to spot the fakes.
Yeah, I think that market for bullhead chronographs, I mean, we've talked about this, is probably going to go insane over the next 6 months because of the Citizen that's featured in the new Tarantino film. And I know that those watches are notorious Franken watches, those Citizens. I don't know whether I've even ever seen a real one for sale, certainly on eBay. If you see like sort of Philippines or India on there. So I think a lot of people need to be careful. I think there's going to be a lot of uninformed watch buyers who just love the look, because it's a great looking watch, who just love the look of it.
And they're out, and the original Citizen bullheads are out there. I'm not a Citizen expert by any stretch. They have their own set of issues. The main thing is that I believe all the cases are base metal cases. So all the Seikos are stainless, 316L, type stainless, but the Citizen bullheads are base metal that are plated. And so You see that with old Swiss chronographs too,
Yeah.
from the day, the 60s and early 70s, and so the cases start to deteriorate, and you have problems like that. So that's a whole nother issue. But yeah, you're right. It can be frightening, but you just need to do a lot of homework and then rely on folks to help you out to make sure you don't make a mistake. But I'm just, I like to believe I know what I'm doing a lot of the times, and I still got both my friend who's a Seiko collector in Cyprus and myself, we got fooled.
So, a two-part question now. First one is there a vintage Seiko chronograph that you think is underrated at the moment? If I was a new collector, do you think there's one that's just probably below what it's worth that you think might be a future classic?
So if I wanted to get into like a vintage Seiko chronograph and maybe not spend as much money. So if you're chasing gold pogues, you're going to, even bad ones, I tell you, the prices just have been keep going up and up and up. You're going to spend a fair amount of money, and you're going to risk too, you're not careful and know what you're doing. You could get a aftermarket dial and that sort of thing. So I would say the best buy right now in the 6139s, and that would be the best way to go, because the 6138 pandas, regardless if they're bullhead or a regular panda dial or a Kakume or what have you, are still going to be expensive, more so than the 60. So what they call them, these are 6139s without the tacky ring on the outside. These are, the one I'm holding in my hand is 6139-6015. So it's important to know that with Seiko, what they do is they in their numbering schema, they use the movement first. So it's a 6139, and then there's a dash, and then there's a model designator. This is a 6015, which means it's a blue dial, probably North American blue dial watch. These are stunning. Seiko was on top of their game in the 1970s, especially with dials. And this dial just pops. It sings. It reflects beautifully. And these are not as, collectors aren't as passionate about them. And I saw one recently, which was an older one than I have. Mine is from 1973. It's from March of 1973. When Seiko's serial numbers, the first digit is the last year of the year it was made. The last digit of the year it was made. So you don't know the decade exactly, but with these watches, we know when they were made, so that's not a mystery. So mine has 33 as the first two numbers, which means it was made in March of 1973. And this one actually was on one of the forums, and it was a resist dial one. It was made in 1970, and it needed to be overhauled, but the guy was selling it for $199. Very reasonable. And you'd think you might, if there's not a major problem with it, you're spending $300 or so to have it rebuilt with a new crystal. So let's say everything goes well and you get done with $500, and you've got a watch that's maybe have it rejeweled, the two jewel problems they have with these, and you have jewels put in, and now the watch will last another 50 years. So that's probably the best way to go, is one of these, like a 6015 watch.
The second part of the question is, what would you suggest to a new collector, like places to buy or forums where you can get kind of more information?
Yeah, I would suggest you subscribe to the forums, and there's Wrist Sushi. There's like I mentioned before, the Seiko Citizen Watch Forum. There's other forums. The one I pay attention to and contribute to the most is the Seiko Citizen Watch Forum, because they got folks that have been doing this for much, much longer than I have. And I learn from them every day. And a lot of the watch restorers are on that forum. In fact, that's how I met Simon Wilkinson out in the UK, is he's a contributor to that forum. And so you get really, really detailed, intricate answers to questions, and people post pictures of subtle variations and whether something's real or not. So you learn a lot. You spend some time on that, and you get to figure out what you like and what you don't like, and what you want to pursue. And that makes sense. And there's also a lot of literature out there by the big watch blogs, like Houdinki's put out a whole large write-up on Seiko chronographs. And some of the other magazines, the large watch magazines like Watch Time, not long ago this year, posted another article on Seiko chronographs, because they are so popular and becoming so collectible. And because of that, what you find is that the good examples are getting harder and harder to find, and just the kind of the bad, the junky ones are what you see more of. So it's getting harder to find, the good examples that are good to be restored.
So you mentioned briefly then about the issue with the jewels. Now this is, I know from my interview with Spencer Klein that this is less of a repair, but this is almost like a preventative maintenance that the repair guys are doing to these movements that are modifying them. Can you just explain a bit about that for people that aren't aware of that?
Absolutely. So these are mechanical contraptions, and what it showed, what over time, what happened, it became evident that what Seiko didn't do is they didn't put jewels in the arbor shaft, which is where the mainspring wraps around. So you have two plates that go on either end of that, like a sandwich. And those plates, instead of having jewels in them, have like a brass bushing or some sort of bushing. And the problem is that over time they get ovaled out. So these, because of all the tension in the mainspring, so these arbors are, like pushing it and ovaling them out over time. And so you get filings in the watch, and then the watch doesn't perform as well as it should because the mainspring's not stable. And so what these restorers are doing, Spencer Klein is an excellent example of that, is they're putting jewels in place. This is what Seiko should have done, but for probably cost saving reasons and maybe other things, they didn't do it. And it's pretty much the only weakness in the watch, in 6139s especially. Once you jewel those arbor ports, that watch, other than like any mechanical watch, you have to have it serviced, but that watch will run forever. These watch restorers are jeweling them. So all of my restorations, I have several from Spencer Klein, from Vintage Time Australia, and the ones from Simon. I have them all put the jewels in. It's only, let's say, about $80 to jewel the plates between the mainspring, and it's worth it.
So I think the two remaining questions, we briefly talked about this, but with each Baselworld, or at least certainly the last three, Seiko have been recreating basically their greatest hits album. So we had the 62 MAS, we had the 1969 mono block watch, and then we had the original Turtle. Do you think that they would even consider doing one of these original chronographs?
Wouldn't it be awesome if they were to bring back the Pogue? Seiko sometimes misses, let's say a lot of times misses the mark, I think, when they bring back their, let's say, a heritage piece. Sometimes they do really good work. I think the 62 MAS was done well. Very expensive, of course, but done well. But the problem is that for the divers, which are, of course, hugely popular, they, meaning Seiko, can use current automatic mechanical movements that they have. And they can use anything going from the 4R, 6R movements all the way up to a spring drive, and that would work great. And so you can do this whole reissue across this continuum of your mechanical movements. But they don't make any mechanical chronograph movements anymore, and haven't since I believe the last 6139 was built in the 78 timeframe. So they would have to bring back that movement, very similar to, it almost have to do what Omega's done, right? With bringing back the original Lamagna movement that was in the Speedmaster. And who knows how much that cost Omega to do that. But if Seiko were to do that, and they could certainly do it, they have the means to do so, that would be the key. And so that would be awesome if they were to actually bring back that 6139 movement and then put it in a watch and keep it true to its heritage.
Yeah, and I'm sure if they did, they'd probably take a leaf out of Omega's book with the 321 movement, where they put it in a platinum cased watch, so it's going to take it into a price bracket that I think is eye-watering even to the most well-off collectors. One of the last questions here is this a holy grail for you of Seiko chronographs? Is there one that is extremely rare, or one that's extremely important that's very hard to get hold of?
That's a great question, of course. And there's a couple answers to that. So I'm still searching for my blue bullhead since I didn't end up getting one. And I have a brown one that Spencer Klein redid, which I love. So I'd have both those bullheads. But in terms of like a 6139, silver dials are what's super, super hot now. But the problem is, and Spencer Klein did a video on this, is that the silver dials are the aftermarket ones are being built, being produced, and they're very good and they're very easy to deceive. And so, because there is so much profit in, let's say, taking an old 6139 and faking it to be a silver dial one, because really good examples. The time teller has one that he got, I guess, about 6 months ago or so. I think it's a resist dialed one, which makes it more rare. And my guess, he got it from a reputable restorer. My guess is that's a $2,500 watch right off. Now it may be more. Who knows? And so I'd love to get a silver dial Pogue, a silver dialed 6139, but just weeding through the morass of trying to find a good example to restore, I just haven't been successful. And when I bid on some, they've gone way too high for what I'm comfortable in bidding. Of course, looking back, I probably should have kept going, just because it would be, the way values and prices are going, it would probably be good. But a silver dialed 6139 is one of my grails.
And I suppose $2,500 is a lot of money for most watch collectors, but it's not even the ticket to entry to one of the luxury brands. So I still think that's quite cool that these are sought after watches, highly collectible. They've got a great following and a support community there, but your actual entry in there, you can sort of ticket for entry, in the $200 to $300 mark to get yourself started off with them, which is still pretty cool, especially for true, horology fans like us.
Right, because you're really buying into some important horology, and you're getting something that's very high quality and something that will last a long time. I'm, looking in the future, I'd like to get, for example, an Omega Mark II. Those, vintage ones, you're starting at what, $2,500, maybe around there, depending on condition. A Flightmaster, an Omega Flightmaster, I love those. And when you look at the prices, you're already, like you said, you're putting out $2,500 or $3,000, depending again on some of these vintage Omegas. So the price of the Seikos in comparison is very reasonable. You're absolutely right. That's one reason I really like them, because I can buy a couple per year or so, a reasonable number of them, and I basically, put together something that would cost me, a nice Omega.
This has been an absolutely fascinating topic, so thanks for taking your time there. So, guys, there was a end of episode 3 fascinating podcast all about Seiko chronographs. Let us know in the comments section down below whether you're listening to this on iTunes or one of the other podcasting service providers. We'd be really interested to know what you think. Just want to say a big thanks to Todd for joining me today.
Thank you, Sam, very much.
As always, guys, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Casual Watch Talk. Thanks, guys. Bye.